Nobody really saw how hard her mornings had gotten. Rachel woke up every single day before the sun did. Not because she set an alarm, but because one of the boys would start fussing right around 4 in the morning, and when one woke up, the other one always followed, like they had some kind of silent agreement between them. She would lie there for just a second, eyes still closed, telling herself she had 5 more minutes, and then she would hear the second cry start up, softer but just as urgent. And that was it. She was already sitting up, feet on the cold floor, moving through the dark apartment toward the corner of the room where both cribs sat side by side. Ellie and Nola were 7 months old, and they were the most beautiful and exhausting thing that had ever happened to her. She would pick up whichever one seemed more upset, prop them against her shoulder, reach over and rub the back of the other one, and just stand there in the dark doing that for however long it took, humming something low and soft. Not really a song, just a sound that seemed to help. By the time both boys were calm and fed and laid back down, it was usually close to 5:30, and Rachel knew there was no point trying to sleep again because her shift at the diner started at 7. So she would go to the kitchen, put on a small pot of coffee, and stand at the counter while it brewed, staring at nothing, trying to pull herself together before the day really started. That was the part nobody saw. The standing in the kitchen alone, in yesterday's clothes, in the quiet before everything got loud again. That was the part she never talked about because there was no one to tell it to, and even if there had been, she wouldn't have known how to explain what it felt like without sounding like she was complaining. And she didn't want to complain, not about her boys, not ever. She had wanted them. She had chosen them even when choosing them meant doing it alone, and she would do it again without hesitating. But wanting something with your whole heart and being completely worn out by it at the same time, those two things can be true together. And Rachel knew that better than most people. She had grown up in a small town about 3 hours away. The kind of town where everyone knew your business and very few people ever left. She had left. She had moved to the city at 22 with a bag, a waitressing job lined up, and the quiet belief that something better was out there if she just kept moving toward it. For a while, she had even believed she found it. She had been in a relationship for almost 4 years. The kind of relationship where you start talking about the future in that easy, assuming way, where you say things like, when we have kids, instead of if. And then she got pregnant, and the man she had said those things with turned into someone she didn't recognize. And by the time the twins were 3 months old, he was gone. Not a difficult goodbye, not a dramatic fight. Just gone. Like he had quietly decided the whole thing was too much and slipped out while she was looking the other way. She didn't have time to be angry about it. Or at least, that's what she told herself. She had 2 babies and a 1-bedroom apartment and a job that paid just enough to make rent and not quite enough to stop worrying. She had picked up a second job on the weekends, a few hours at a pharmacy near her apartment, and her neighbor, a retired woman in her 60s who had taken a liking to the boys, would come over and sit with them during those shifts. Rachel hated asking for help, hated the feeling of owing someone something she might not be able to repay. But she had learned that being a good mother sometimes meant setting her pride down and doing the practical thing. The twins had a formula they needed, a specific kind, the kind the pediatrician had circled on a paper and said was best for their stomachs, the kind that wasn't available at every store and wasn't cheap when you did find it. Rachel had looked up alternatives. She had asked questions at the pharmacy where she worked. She had read everything she could find online late at night when the boys were sleeping, and she should have been sleeping too. Every answer pointed back to the same canister with the same price tag. And so every month she built her budget around it the same way she built it around rent. Not as a choice, but as a fact. She kept a small notebook in the kitchen drawer where she tracked every dollar coming in and every dollar going out. And it was a precise, careful thing, that notebook, full of small adjustments and crossed out numbers and asterisks that meant maybe if nothing goes wrong this month. Things went wrong most months. Not in dramatic ways. A parking ticket, a copay she hadn't planned for, a week of slow tips. The kind of small bad luck that doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud but adds up fast when the margins are already thin. She never let the boys see her stress about it. She was careful about that. When she was with them, she was fully with them, making faces until they laughed, narrating her movements around the apartment in a silly voice so they would track her with their big dark eyes, laying on the floor next to their playmat and letting them grab her fingers and pull. She loved them in this enormous, full-body way that sometimes caught her off guard even now, like it was still new information. She would be changing one of them and look down at his face and just feel this wave of something so strong she couldn't name it. Not happiness exactly, more like the recognition of something she would protect at any cost, no matter how tired she was, no matter what the notebook said. She taped 2 photos above the cribs, one of each boy, taken on the day she brought them home from the hospital, and every morning, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. She looked at those photos before she left the apartment and reminded herself what all of it was for. She was not failing. She was carrying something heavy, and she was still standing, and for now, that was enough. The week it all fell apart started on a Monday, which felt about right. Because if something is going to go wrong, it might as well go wrong at the beginning of the week and get it over with. Rachel had been running on maybe 4 hours of sleep when she got to her car that morning and turned the key and heard the sound, that grinding, reluctant sound that a car makes right before it decides it's done cooperating with you. She sat there for a moment, both hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead, and took a slow breath. She had a shift in 40 minutes. She called a coworker, got a ride, got through the day, and that evening called the mechanic 2 blocks from her apartment who had fixed her car once before and was at least honest about what things cost. He called her back the next morning and told her it was the alternator, and the number he quoted her was not a small one. She had a small savings fund she kept in a separate account. She thought of it as the something goes wrong fund, because something always went wrong. And she used almost all of it in one transfer, just like that, and sat with the receipt on her phone for a long time after, doing the math in her head, rearranging numbers that didn't want to be rearranged. She told herself it was okay. She would rebuild it. She had rebuilt it before. Then 2 days later, her weekend job cut her hours. Not permanently, the manager said, just for the next few weeks. They were overstaffed, scheduling had gotten complicated. He was sorry about it. She smiled and said she understood, because what else do you say? And then she walked to her car and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before driving home. When she got back to the apartment, both boys were awake and happy and reaching for her the moment she walked in, and she picked them up one at a time and held them close and breathed them in, because they were the thing that made the math matter and also the thing that made the math terrifying. She thanked her neighbor, locked the door, fed the boys, put them down, and then sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her and did what she always did when things got tight. She went through every line, every number, looking for something she could move or cut or push to next month. There wasn't much. She had already been running lean. The formula was due to run out in about 2 weeks, which she had marked with a small circle at the top of the page, and now that circle seemed to pulse at her every time she looked at it. She told herself she had time. She would figure it out before then. She didn't figure it out before then. The formula ran out on a Thursday, faster than she expected because the boys had been going through more of it during a growth stretch, and she realized it that evening when she picked up the canister and felt how light it was. She shook it just to confirm, and it gave that hollow sound that made her stomach drop. She had enough for the next morning's feeding, maybe one more after that, and then nothing. She put the boys down for the night, made a list on her phone of every store within driving distance that might carry the brand, and decided she would go out the next day after her morning shift and find it. She was not panicked. She was organized. She had handled harder things than this. The next afternoon, she drove to the first store on her list, a big grocery chain about 10 minutes away, and they were out. She asked the woman at the customer service desk, who looked it up and told her there had been some kind of regional supply issue, and they weren't sure when they'd be restocked. Rachel thanked her and drove to the next store, also out. The third store had a different version of the brand, a slightly different formulation, and Rachel stood in the aisle and looked at it for a long time, reading the label, comparing it to the one her pediatrician had recommended, and ultimately put it back because she wasn't going to take chances with the boys' stomachs over a few dollars. She drove to a fourth store, a large pharmacy on the other side of town, one she didn't usually go to, and she walked straight to the baby aisle and felt something loosen in her chest when she saw one canister, just one, sitting on the shelf exactly where it was supposed to be. She picked it up like it was something fragile. She carried it to the register. There was a short line and she waited in it quietly, the canister tucked under her arm, and when it was her turn, she put it on the counter and slid her card into the reader. She watched the screen. It took a second longer than usual, and then the word came up that she had been dreading somewhere in the back of her mind the whole drive over. Declined. She pulled the card out and looked at it like it might have an explanation written on it, and then she slid it back in and tried again. Declined again. She stepped to the side so the person behind her could go ahead, and she stood there and opened her banking app and looked at the number and understood, in the particular way that people understand things they were already half expecting, that there was not enough. The car repair and the lost hours and the regular bills had all landed at the same time, and the account was sitting at a number that wouldn't cover what was in her hand. She stood in that bright, fluorescent-lit pharmacy. People moving around her, a television playing something in the background near the pharmacy counter, someone's kid asking a question in another aisle, and she felt the tears come before she could stop them. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and unstoppable. The way crying happens when you've been holding it back for too long and your body finally just decides it's done waiting for a better time. She wasn't crying about the formula, not really. She was crying about the alternator and the cut hours and the notebook with the crossed out numbers, and every single morning she had stood in the kitchen alone at 5:30 trying to hold it all together. The formula was just the moment everything reached the surface. She wasn't making a scene. That was the thing about Rachel. Even in the middle of falling apart, she was quiet about it. She had moved a few steps away from the register, closer to the end of the aisle, and she was standing with her back half turned toward the store, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other still holding the canister of formula against her side like she hadn't decided yet whether to put it back or keep trying to figure something out. Her eyes were wet, and she was blinking fast, the way you do when you're trying to talk yourself out of crying in public, and your body is just not listening. She was looking at her phone again, moving between her banking app and her contacts like she was hoping a solution would appear somewhere on the screen if she just kept scrolling, and her lips were pressed together in that tight, concentrated way that people get when they're running out of options but not ready to admit it yet. The store hummed around her, a steady, indifferent hum of refrigeration units and background music and the routine noise of strangers going about their evenings. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked twice. That's the thing about public spaces, especially busy ones in the early evening. Everyone is inside their own world, thinking about dinner or the drive home or the thing they forgot to do before they left work, and a woman standing quietly by herself near the baby aisle doesn't register as anything that needs attention. She was invisible in the way that struggling people so often are, right in the middle of a room full of other people. There was a man standing a few feet behind where she had been in line. He was somewhere in his late 50s, wearing a plain dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, the kind of person you wouldn't look at twice, no particular reason to. Nothing that stood out about him, just a man holding a small basket with a few items in it, waiting his turn. He had been behind her in line when her card declined the first time. He had watched her step aside and try again and step aside again. He hadn't said anything, hadn't reacted visibly, had just moved up when the cashier gestured him forward and quietly placed his own items on the counter. But he hadn't stopped watching, not in an intrusive way, not in the way that makes someone feel observed, just in the careful, unhurried way that some people have of paying attention to the world around them without broadcasting that they're doing it. He had grown up paying that kind of attention because when you grow up without much, you learn to read a room. You learn to recognize the particular body language of someone trying to hold themselves together, because you have stood that way yourself, in different stores in different decades, feeling that same specific weight of not enough. He knew what he was looking at. He paid for his items, took his bag from the cashier, and then instead of walking toward the exit, he paused and said something quietly to the cashier, too low for anyone nearby to hear clearly. The cashier, a young woman who looked barely out of high school, glanced toward Rachel and then back at the man, and he said something else and gave a small nod. And the cashier looked at the canister still sitting on the counter from Rachel's transaction and nodded slowly like she understood. The man set his bag down, pulled out his wallet, and handed over a card. Calm, easy, like it was nothing remarkable, like he was just finishing up something he'd already decided. Then he picked up his bag again and walked over to where Rachel was standing. She looked up when she sensed someone approaching, the way you do when you've been trying to be invisible and suddenly someone breaks through it, and her eyes were still glassy, and her expression had that raw, unguarded look that faces get when they've been caught mid-cry by someone unexpected. He didn't make it into something big. He didn't put a hand on her shoulder or tilt his head in that exaggerated sympathetic way, or use the kind of voice people sometimes use that makes you feel smaller instead of better. He just looked at her directly and said, simply and plainly, that he had taken care of it at the register, and that there were 2 more canisters coming from the back if the cashier could find them in the stockroom, and that she should take them all home. Rachel stared at him for a moment, not quite processing it. She opened her mouth, and he shook his head slightly, the kind of small gesture that means don't, just let it be, and he said something close to, "You've clearly got enough going on. Just go home to your kids." And then before she could say thank you or ask who he was or do anything at all, he turned and walked toward the exit at the same unhurried pace he'd had the whole time, pushed through the door, and was gone. He didn't look back. He didn't slow down. He stepped out into the parking lot and disappeared into the ordinary evening like he had just picked up milk and gone on with his life. Rachel stood where she was for a moment, the canister still in her hands, trying to catch up to what had just happened. The cashier appeared at the end of the aisle a minute later holding 2 more canisters and told her they'd found them in the back, that the gentleman had prepaid for all 3, and handed them over with a small, careful smile, the kind of smile that people give when they've witnessed something they didn't expect to see that day. Rachel looked down at the 3 canisters in her arms and felt the tears come again, but different this time, not the heavy drowning kind from a few minutes ago, but something lighter and harder to name. The particular feeling of being seen by a stranger in a moment when you felt completely invisible. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know his name or where he came from or why he had done it without waiting for a thank you or making it a moment about himself. She just knew that she was standing in a pharmacy with enough formula to get through the next few weeks, and the tightness that had been sitting in her chest all day had loosened just enough to breathe. And sometimes that is exactly what one person can do for another without either of them fully understanding how much it meant. She didn't tell anyone about it that night. She drove home with the 3 canisters on the passenger seat, stopped once at a red light and looked over at them like she needed to confirm they were still there, and then walked up to her apartment, knocked quietly to let her neighbor know she was back, and went straight to the boys. They were both awake, propped up on a little floor mat, with toys around them. And when they saw her come through the door, their faces did that thing they always did. That full body lighting up, arms starting to move, mouths opening into wide gummy expressions that were not quite smiles but were better than smiles. And she sat down on the floor right there without even taking off her jacket and pulled them both into her and just stayed like that for a while. She didn't cry again. She was done crying for the day. She just sat on the floor with her boys and let the evening be quiet and ordinary. And when she finally put them down and cleaned up and got into bed, she stared at the ceiling for a little while, thinking about the man in the baseball cap, about how quickly he had moved, how unbothered he had seemed, how he had walked out that door without once looking back to see how she'd reacted. And she thought that was probably the strangest and most decent thing about the whole moment, that he hadn't needed her reaction at all. She fell asleep thinking she would never know who he was, and she was mostly at peace with that. What she didn't know was that someone else in that pharmacy had seen the whole thing. A younger woman, maybe mid-20s, had been standing near the end of the aisle picking something off a bottom shelf when Rachel's card had declined, and she had stayed where she was, not wanting to make the moment more uncomfortable by walking past, and she had ended up watching the whole thing play out, the second decline, Rachel stepping aside, the quiet man at the register, the short exchange in the aisle, all of it. She hadn't planned to record anything. She had taken out her phone initially to check a text message, and then the moment had unfolded in front of her, and she had, almost without deciding to, started filming. She only caught the tail end of it, maybe 40 seconds, the part where the man was speaking to Rachel, and then his back as he walked away, and then Rachel standing in the aisle holding the canisters with that expression on her face that was impossible to look at without feeling something. The woman had watched it back once in her car before driving home and sat with it for a long time before posting it. She didn't identify either person. She didn't add much of a caption. Something simple about witnessing kindness in an unexpected place, and she went home and didn't think too much about it. By the next morning, the video had been shared tens of thousands of times. By the evening of the day after that, it had crossed into the millions. People were sharing it without fully being able to explain why. There was something about the plainness of it, the lack of performance, the way the man had just walked out afterward like it was nothing, that hit people somewhere they weren't expecting. Comments filled up with people saying it had made them cry on their lunch break, or that they had watched it 4 times in a row, or that they had immediately called their mother after seeing it. It moved in that particular way that only certain things move online. Not because it was dramatic or shocking, but because it was quietly, undeniably real. Then people started looking more closely at the man in the video. The cap was pulled low, and his face was mostly turned away from the camera. But someone paused the footage at just the right moment and posted a still. And within a few hours there were enough people comparing details, the jacket, the general build, a partial profile, that a name started circulating. It was not a name that everyone would recognize the way they might recognize an actor or a musician. But in certain circles, in the world of business and technology, it was a significant name. A man who had built a software company from nothing in his early 30s, had taken it public, had spent the last decade putting large amounts of money into food access programs and early childhood initiatives, mostly without talking about it publicly. A very wealthy man who had a well-documented habit of moving through the world without the trappings that usually surround very wealthy men. No security detail visible in his daily life. No entourage, no consistent public presence. When a journalist from a mid-sized news outlet reached out to his team for comment, the response that came back was brief and confirmed nothing beyond the fact that he had been in the area that evening and that he had no statement to offer, which, somehow, only made people more certain it was him, and only made them like him more for it. Rachel found out the video existed because her neighbor texted her a link 2 days after the pharmacy, with a message that just said, "Is this you?" She watched it sitting at the kitchen table and felt a strange mix of things move through her all at once. The privacy of that moment suddenly being somewhere she hadn't put it, in front of millions of people she would never meet, and at the same time a kind of relief she hadn't anticipated. The relief of having something that had happened to her privately be witnessed, be confirmed as real and worth something by more people than she could count. She gave one interview to a local reporter who had reached out through a community group she was part of, and she was careful and measured in what she said. She didn't talk about her finances in detail. She didn't perform gratitude for the camera. She said simply that she had been having a hard week and a stranger had helped her without making her feel small for needing it, and that she wanted her boys to grow up knowing that the world had people like that in it. She was asked if she knew who the man was. She said she had heard the speculation. She said it didn't really change anything for her, that it had mattered exactly as much when she thought he was nobody as it did now. Then, almost quietly toward the end of the conversation, the reporter mentioned something that had come up in the background research, that the man widely believed to be the one in the video had grown up in a low-income household, raised by a single mother who had struggled with food insecurity when he was young. Rachel listened to that and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, like something had just settled into place, and said, "Yeah, that makes sense," and left it there. The internet moved on, the way the internet always does. And within a couple of weeks, the video had been replaced in people's feeds by other things, other moments, other strangers doing unexpected things in ordinary places. That's the natural rhythm of it. Something breaks through, touches people, gets shared until it becomes background noise, and then something new arrives and takes its place. But the things that had been set in motion by that 40-second clip in a pharmacy aisle did not stop moving just because the attention did. That's the part that doesn't make it into the original story. The part that happens after the comment section goes quiet and the share count stops climbing. The actual, slow, unglamorous work of a life beginning to shift. Rachel had not asked for any of what followed. She had not posted anything herself, had not sought out attention, had not tried to turn the moment into something that would benefit her beyond what had already happened. But the interview she gave rippled outward in ways she hadn't anticipated, and in the weeks after it ran, she started receiving messages through the community group that had connected her with the reporter. Some were just kind words from strangers who had seen the story and wanted her to know they were rooting for her, and she read those carefully, and they meant more than she could easily say. But some were different. A woman who ran a non-profit focused on supporting single parents in the city reached out directly and offered Rachel a connection to a food assistance program that could cover the specialty formula for the next 6 months at no cost. Rachel sat with that email for a full day before responding, that old resistance rising up in her the way it always did, the stubborn, private part of her that didn't like accepting things she hadn't earned. And then she thought about the man in the pharmacy, about how cleanly and simply he had offered what he had, without making her feel like a project. And she thought about her neighbor who came over every weekend without being asked. And she thought about the colleague who had driven her to work the morning her car wouldn't start. And she understood again what she had to keep learning. That accepting help was not the same as giving up. That letting people steady you was not weakness. It was just the honest acknowledgement that nobody actually does any of this alone, no matter how much they tell themselves they do. She wrote back and said yes. A few weeks after that, the same nonprofit connected her with a workforce development program that offered evening and weekend training in healthcare administration, a field she had been quietly interested in for years, ever since she had spent time in a hospital waiting room with one of the boys during a minor health scare and had watched the administrative staff work and thought, I could do that. I think I'd be good at that. The program was free, the schedule was designed around people who were already working, and they offered a small childcare subsidy for participants. She enrolled and told almost no one because she didn't want to talk about it until there was something to show for it, and because she had learned that announcing plans too early had a way of making them feel less real. She just started going 2 evenings a week, sitting in a classroom with other adults who were all quietly rebuilding something, and she liked it more than she had expected to. Liked the structure of it, liked learning things she could see the shape of, liked the small, competent feeling of understanding something new. The boys grew. They grew in the fast, slightly alarming way that babies grow in their first year, where you feel like if you look away for too long, you'll miss an entire developmental stage. Ellie started pulling himself up to standing by holding the edge of the couch, wobbling there with a look of enormous concentration on his face. And Rachel would sit on the floor a few feet away and resist the urge to hover because he needed to figure it out himself. Noah was slower to do that, but faster to talk, or to attempt talking, which mostly meant a series of sounds that meant nothing and everything simultaneously, delivered with tremendous confidence. She took photos constantly, more than she would ever need, because she had this persistent low-level fear that she would forget the details, that the days were moving so fast that the specific texture of them would blur, and she wanted to hold on to all of it. The man who had helped her that evening in the pharmacy never reached out to her directly. He didn't send a message through the community group or contact her after the interview ran or do anything at all, as far as she could tell, to follow the story he had inadvertently become part of. Several months after the video had circulated, a small announcement appeared through a foundation connected to his name, a substantial contribution to a national organization working on infant nutrition access, specifically targeting the gap in availability and affordability of specialty formula for low-income families. The announcement did not reference the video or Rachel or anything that had happened in that pharmacy. It was written in the plain, factual language of philanthropy, and most people who read it would have had no reason to connect it to a 40-second clip from several months earlier. But Rachel saw it because someone sent it to her, and she read it twice. And then she closed her phone and looked over at the boys who were both on the floor, engaged in some kind of disagreement over a toy neither of them had shown any interest in until the other one picked it up, and she felt something warm and uncomplicated move through her. She didn't know if the donation was connected to what had happened, or if it was something that had been in motion long before that evening. It didn't really matter. What mattered was that someone had looked at a problem in the world and decided to do something about it, quietly and without ceremony. The same way he had looked at a woman crying in an aisle and decided to do something about that. The through line was the same. She finished the certification program on a Thursday evening in early spring and walked out of the building into cool air, holding a folder with her paperwork in it. And she sat in her car for a minute before starting it, not crying, not overwhelmed, just sitting with the specific, earned feeling of having done something hard, and finished it. Then she drove home to her boys, the same way she always did. The same route, the same apartment, the same 2 small faces that lit up when she came through the door. And she thought that this, all of this, the hard parts and the lucky parts and the unexpected parts and the slow, steady parts, was the real story, not the 40 seconds in a pharmacy, everything that came after.
Thanks for watching my video. Like, subscribe and share.